In 2021, a scientist in Copenhagen held a lock of hair in his hands that was over 100 years old and had belonged to the most iconic warrior in American history. And when his team sequenced the DNA inside that hair, they found something that no history book had ever told us. Something that quietly rewrites everything. Because buried inside that genetic code was a signal that by every rule of science and by every migration map ever drawn should not have been there. Because what that signal pointed to was the other side of the world. This is not a story about what we know. This is a story about what we got wrong. So let's start with the part everyone thinks they know about the Sioux, the Plains warriors, and the people who broke Custer at Little Bighorn as the last great resistance against a tide that couldn't be stopped. That image is real, and that history happened. But it's not the beginning of the story. It's barely the middle, and if you want to understand who the Sioux actually are and where they actually came from, you have to go somewhere most history books never take you, which means you have to go into the DNA. Here's how scientists read ancient ancestry, because inside every human being alive today, there's something called mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down only from the mother, unchanged generation after generation, from grandmother to daughter, across thousands of years and across entire civilizations, rising and falling. Scientists call the patterns in this DNA haplogroups, which you can think of as a surname written not in ink, but in your biology, telling them exactly where your maternal ancestors walked 10,000 years ago. Native Americans carry 5 primary haplogroups known as A, B, C, D, and X. And while the first 4 have a clean trail with ancestral forms existing in Siberia, near the land bridge that once connected Asia and North America during the last ice age, showing a genetic map that makes sense and a migration path that fits neatly in a textbook, there is Haplogroup X. Haplogroup X is present in roughly 15% of the Sioux population, which is not a rounding error or noise, but a significant genetic presence in one of the most studied indigenous peoples in the world. But here is what makes scientists lose sleep over it. Because Haplogroup X is not in Siberia, it is not near the land bridge, and it is not in the populations that gave rise to all the other Native American haplogroups. The other 4 left footprints across the Bering Corridor like a clean trail through snow, but Haplogroup X left nothing. No trail, no ancestor population, and no clean explanation. Instead, and this is the part that stops people cold, Haplogroup X in its closest related forms appears in the Middle East, in the Caucasus, and in parts of southern Europe. Scientists call it the X problem, and it has never been fully resolved. But when something like this surfaces in science, 3 explanations usually emerge, and each one is both compelling and incomplete. And that tension is exactly what makes this story matter. The first explanation is a transatlantic migration, suggesting ancient people, possibly related to the Solutrean culture of Ice Age Spain, crossed the Atlantic along coastlines the way Arctic peoples have always traveled by sea, and eventually their descendants mixed with the ancestors of the Sioux. In the 1990s and early 2000s, this theory had genuine academic traction because the parallels between Solutrean stone tools and early American Clovis technology are real, striking, and not easily dismissed. But then in 2015, a skeleton changed everything. Kennewick Man, over 8,000 years old and found in Washington state, had a bone structure that suggested to some researchers a European or Polynesian ancestry. But his DNA said something completely different, proving he was unambiguously, clearly Native American, and closely related to the indigenous peoples of that very region. So the transatlantic theory, at least as a primary answer, did not survive that test. So what else could explain it? Because the second theory looks at Beringia itself, the ancient landmass between Siberia and Alaska that is now swallowed by the sea, arguing that the founding population that crossed into North America was not a single uniform group, but they were diverse and spent thousands of years geographically isolated in Beringia. Some geneticists argue that haplogroup X2A evolved in place during that isolation from an ancestral form that existed in Greater Siberia and simply went extinct on the Asian side while surviving in the Americas, which is a coherent explanation that is also, with current evidence, impossible to prove. And then there is the third theory, and this one quietly changes how you see the whole story, pointing to a back migration through new research published in Current Biology that analyzed the DNA of 3 individuals who died on a riverbank in Kamchatka, in northeastern Siberia, approximately 500 years ago. Their genomes contained clear North American ancestry, which means some Native American population had crossed back across the Bering Sea, moved into Siberia, mixed with the local people there, and left a record behind, proving the passage across that water for 10,000 years was apparently never a one-way road, but was more like a bridge that people used in both directions for millennia until the sea rose and the bridge simply vanished. Think about that for a moment, because the story we were told was that people crossed from Asia into America and stayed, but the actual story was that people crossed and recrossed and moved back and mixed and moved forward again for thousands of years across a geography we can no longer even see. But here is the finding that reframes all of it. In 2014, researchers analyzed the genome of a 24,000-year-old Siberian boy unearthed from a site called Malelta, known in the literature as MA1, and what they found shook the framework of the entire discussion. Between 14 and 38% of his ancestry derived from a population that also contributed to the ancestors of modern West Eurasians, meaning this ancient Siberian boy, 24,000 years old and found in the middle of Siberia, had partial Western Eurasian-like ancestry. And that same ancient signal appears in the genomes of Native Americans across the entire continent, not just the Sioux, because virtually all tested indigenous American populations carry it. This means the Sioux did not acquire this signal recently through contact, through trade, or through any historical mixing, but they carried it from the very beginning, as it was present in the founding Siberian population that crossed into North America 15 to 20,000 years ago. That population was itself already a mixture of ancient East Asian ancestry and ancient West Eurasian-related ancestry, merged together tens of thousands of years before anyone set foot in the Americas. The anomaly is not a mystery about the Sioux. It is a mystery about the entire human story, about the world before borders, before nations, and before the idea that any people ever came from just one place. And now here is the part of the history that the Sioux themselves always knew. This part was recorded by early European ethnographers who actually listened to the elders in the 18th and 19th centuries, and then, for some reason, largely forgotten by the people who wrote the textbooks, because the Sioux were never originally from the Great Plains. Their own oral traditions say it clearly that the ancestors came from the east, from a great river, and from a land of trees and mounds far from the open grasslands. And this is not myth, because modern linguistic and archaeological evidence supports it precisely. The Proto-Siouan language, the common ancestor of Lakota, Dakota, Osage, and related dialects, points to an origin homeland in the Ohio River Valley and the upper Mississippi region, while archaeological sites in Minnesota, including Granite Falls and Browns Valley, confirm the presence of Dakota ancestors in the Great Lakes region by the late woodland period around 500 AD. For most of that history, the ancestors of the Sioux were not nomadic buffalo hunters, but they were semi-sedentary woodland people who cultivated maize, hunted, and gathered along rivers and built communities in forests. The iconic image of feathered riders sweeping across open grassland is real, but it is the final chapter of a far longer, far more complicated journey, which began when the Ojibwe, pressing westward after acquiring firearms in the early 18th century, pushed the Sioux out of Minnesota and Wisconsin and onto the Great Plains. And there, within a few generations, they encountered the horse, introduced by Spanish settlers into North America centuries earlier, and transformed themselves with extraordinary speed into the plains culture that would become their most visible identity. The people who fought and won at Little Bighorn had only been on horseback for about 100 years, so let that land. Because the greatest cavalry warriors in North American history, the people who have become synonymous with the Great Plains, with open sky, and with freedom on horseback, had only been doing it for 100 years, which is just 2, maybe 3 generations. Their great-grandparents had been forest people. Their great-great-grandparents had been woodland farmers. And their ancestors 10,000 years removed had walked out of Siberia carrying a genetic signature that connected them to populations on the other side of Eurasia, creating a connection that even today science cannot fully explain. And then we come back to Copenhagen, back to that lock of hair, because when Professor Eske Villerslev and his team at Cambridge confirmed that Ernie Lapointe, a living man and a great-grandson of Sitting Bull, carried the genuine DNA of his famous ancestor, they weren't just solving a genealogical puzzle. Something much heavier than that was sitting in that laboratory. Because Sitting Bull's children had been separated from their families, the Sioux language had been beaten out of children in boarding schools. Their ceremonies were outlawed, and their lands were taken, meaning the story of who they were was rewritten, repeatedly, by people who had never asked them. And yet the genetics survived all of it, traveling through bodies across centuries, enduring displacement, erasure, and forced assimilation. In a man standing in a laboratory in Denmark, watching a screen confirm what his family had always known. Here is what the full picture tells us. Not just about the Sioux, about all of us, because there is no population on this earth whose ancestry is simple, and the clean stories of bounded nations. Singular homelands and pure bloodlines are always, without exception, later constructions. They are stories placed over a reality that was always more fluid, more layered, and more entangled than we wanted to believe. Because the Sioux were woodland farmers before they were plains warriors, and they were forest people before they were horseback riders. And before any of that, they were the descendants of ancient Siberians, who were themselves already a mixture of worlds, east and west, ancient and unknowable, carrying inside them a signal that still has no clean answer. Every layer of this story is real, and none of them cancel the others, because they accumulate the way all human histories accumulate into something that resists easy summary. And that cannot be reduced to a single origin, a single identity, or a single image on a textbook cover. The Sioux were never just what we thought they were, and neither, if you're honest about it, are any of us. So if you believe some stories are too important to be forgotten, subscribe to Deep Dynasties.